fifth edition of the interview series hosted by the UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice. My name is Ria Ligari. I'm the COP and Virtual Dialogue Consultant for the UN Women Training Center. I'm very lucky today to be joined by Jane Kato-Wallace of Promundo, who will be speaking to us today about gender transformative approaches to training for gender equality. Before we begin, I'd just like to explain that this COP interview series features a range of interviews with experts on topics related to training for gender equality. It runs from June and it will finish in December 2017. So each interview lasts about half an hour, and our listeners have the chance to ask questions by clicking on the hand raising tab on the side of the platform, or by sending in their questions at any time using the questions tab, which is on the right side of the webinar platform. So you can use that at any time, and when we get to the end of the interview in about half an hour, we can start looking through your questions and Jane can answer them. So let me introduce our guest for today. Jane Kato-Wallace is the Program Director at Promundo US, which is a leading global organization in promoting gender justice and preventing violence by engaging men and boys in partnership with women and girls. Jane is an expert in program development, training, and research related to engaging men and boys. She's been at the forefront of developing and expanding several campaigns, including the Global Men Care campaign. She also trains Promundo's international partners on implementing Program P, which is a gender transformative, multi-pronged approach to engaging men as caregivers. I should also mention that Jane was the Good Practice representative who contributed information to the UN Women Training Center's Compendium of Good Practices on Training. So I'd encourage all of our listeners to access the compendium, which is available on the Training Center's website, and you can learn more there about Promundo's exemplary experiences of gender transformative training with UNFPA in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and also with World Fish in Cambodia and Zambia. So let's begin. Jane, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today. Hi, it's great to have you. So I'm just going to dive into the questions then. At Promundo, you've spent many years promoting the role and the engagement of men and boys in gender equality around the world. So before we talk about Promundo's approach, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your personal experience of training for gender equality. Basically, what prompted your interest in this subject, and how did you become a trainer?
Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. That's a good question, Ria. So my interest in training actually started when I was in graduate school. I took a course on teaching sexuality education, and there I learned various pedagogies that teachers, facilitators, trainers use to get youth to think critically about their bodies, about their minds, about human rights. And I think that I also became familiar with thought leaders like the Brazilian writer Paulo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, who spoke about the need to kind of critically transform the relationship between teacher and student. So that is probably what prompted my interest. It was just such a different way of learning and teaching. And then when I joined Promundo, I had the privilege of working with really inspiring gender trainers, including Anand Power from SEMIAC. I think you've had him on the on your webinar series before. Yes. Osvaldo Montoya from Puntos de Encuentro. Formerly from Puntos de Encuentro, who both really inspired me to bring in sort of the emotional side to what it is that we do when we're doing our gender trainings, and not be scared to talk about them. It's not just about, facilitating the learning of different concepts, but also about making it personal. So yeah, that's how it started.
That's a great answer. Yeah. And well, I want to ask, because you talked about the emotional side of gender training and really making a connection with people, and I think that seems to be really at the core of Promundo's work, especially when it comes to engaging men as caregivers. Yeah. So I wondered why do you, and Promundo more broadly, why do you feel it's so important to engage men and boys as caregivers?
I think for me, if I could get a little personal here, I think for me, I think looking back on the relationship I had with my own father and the things that I wished that he had done probably a little bit better to be more present. I think that's what sort of drives me in thinking about the future of other people's fathers. I also think that he was very much shaped by ideals of masculinity and had this specific identity about what a father should be. A father should provide material things for his daughters. A father should, be the primary breadwinner. But there were so many other dimensions that I was personally missing that I wish that had been there. And I think that sort of relates to how we do our work. One of the reasons why we believe engaging men as fathers is incredibly important is because not only does it benefit children in terms of their emotional, psychological, physical development, not only does it open up opportunities for women in terms of having men shoulder the unpaid care burden, but it also benefits men themselves. There are lots of studies that show that men who are more emotionally connected to their families, men who are who take on, sort of the more unglamorous parts of being a parent, live longer and happier lives. And one of the recent reports that we published, called State of the World's Fathers, really, the webcam just shut off, but I can. Okay. So I think that Ruya had a technical difficulty. So I'm going to turn my webcam back on. And Ruya had kindly sent me the questions ahead of time. So I will interview myself, I guess, until she is able to log back on, which I'm sure will be just really soon, actually. So another question that she had was, how did I learn to become a gender trainer? So I learned to become a trainer partly through my education in public health school. I went to Columbia University, and it was a very research-oriented curriculum, and I still use a lot of those methods in my everyday work, but I find that most of the learnings that I pull from actually come from the sexuality course that I had taken and that I referenced earlier in the interview. The way of sort of opening up spaces for critical reflection and dialogue, I think are lessons. Those are pedagogies that transfer over almost to any topic, especially gender. I was also thrown into it when I joined Promundo in 2001. It seems to be our organizational style. I had never trained on masculinities before, and one of the first couple months that I joined, I had to learn how to do it. I'd done trainings on young men's health, I'd done trainings on gender, but really never sort of bringing the two together. So my first experience was going to Sri Lanka and doing a training on engaging men as caregivers, and luckily I had Gary Barker with me, who really showed me the ropes and who really modeled for me, I think, a lot of the teachings that I think I use to this day. And then from then on, I sort of never looked back. Every single training I think is different, depending on both the needs of the organization, but also, based on how I've been inspired looking at other trainers and how they work. Another question she had was, why is it important to engage men as caregivers? I sort of answered this a little bit before, but we at Promundo look at engaging men engaging men and boys in caregiving as important for two different reasons that are also interconnected. First, it's important to engage men because they are potentially, and already are, women's allies in the fight for gender equality. In this patriarchal world that we live in, we really need, I think, men in positions of power to speak up and use their respective platforms to talk about gender equality, and also give us the space to do so. We also don't live our lives in isolation. So whether we're thinking about how to prevent the spread of HIV, or whether we're talking about ending domestic violence, men and boys have to be part of this, part of the solution. The second reason is because men are also individuals with human rights and their own vulnerabilities that deserve attention. And men and boys also suffer from sort of these patriarchal structures that we all find ourselves in, and they are disadvantaged when they buy into ideas about hegemonic masculinity. So gender equality benefits men too. Okay, the other question she had was, how does gender training help us to engage men in gender equality? Well, it helps because a lot of organizations have questions and are curious about, we know why engaging men and boys is important, but how do we do it? What does it look like? So the trainings that I do are very much rooted in being practical and being concrete and intermixing that personal and the political with, well, how do we translate that that mode of thinking, the approaches around gender transformative programming, into what it is that you're already doing. I think there's a lot of fear that, if we start engaging men and boys, does it mean that the work with women and girls is over? But that's very much far from the truth. If anything, it's about strengthening existing approaches around women's empowerment. That is what we're really trying to do, and examining the power dynamics, the unequal power dynamics that exist within relationships and at multiple levels of society. She also had a question about Program P, Promundo's approach to engaging men as caregivers. Tell us about the program and its gender transformative approach. So first of all, Program P stands for Pai or Padre, which means father in Portuguese and Spanish respectively. It is a multi-pronged intervention and was created based on a need that feminist scholars have been saying for decades, which is that women are burdened or are facing the double burden of having to both shoulder the income earning role as well as the unpaid care burden. In the past few decades, we've seen a dramatic increase in women entering the workplace, but we haven't seen a proportional increase in men taking on their roles in unpaid care work. So there is a lot of reason as to why engaging men and caregivers in this way is important. So we developed the curriculum to open up space for men to critically examine the harmful norms around fatherhood and how buying into such harmful norms has costs, not only to women and children, but to men themselves. So the first section includes a series of group education activities that trained facilitators can do with fathers. So fathers who have or will soon become fathers. So for fathers who have children ages 0 to 3. That's the group education section. The second section is around, is dedicated or directed at public health providers and how they can better engage men in antenatal and postnatal care. And in addition to that, how to create father-friendly spaces. There's also a third section on how to create community campaigns as well. The next question that she has for me, I hope everyone can hear me okay, is what is gender transformation? So gender transformation is an approach to intentionally challenge and change harmful gender norms that underpin a lot of the different behaviors, negative health outcomes that we see. It's about working together with communities to identify what those harmful norms are and developing solutions together with them to how to tackle those and challenge those harmful norms and redefine what manhood and womanhood means to them. As it relates to our work on engaging men, we use that idea, but think about it from a masculinities perspective, and how those harmful norms around masculinity and what it means to be a man are reinforced and perpetuated at different levels of society. Okay, the next question is, how do Promundo's trainers and program directors implement gender transformative approaches on the ground? In Promundo's trainings, we use a Paulo Freirean approach, which is to increase an individual's capacity to choose a particular course of action and follow through. And that course of action is developed through kind of critical reflection. So that critical reflection leads to sort of the course of action. So a lot of the tools that we use at Promundo are based on this consciousness raising. And more practically, I use a lot of the activities from Program H and Program M. A lot of different trainers have their kind of go-to activities, and I have mine. Program H and Program M are curricula to work with young men and young women. So H stands for homem or hombre, which means man in Portuguese and Spanish, and M stands for mulher or mujer, which is for woman in Spanish and Portuguese. So in addition to those kind of group education tools, I also like to intermix that with using personal stories. For trainings on fatherhood, we have a series of films from our Global Men Care campaign. They're anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, but they're wonderful. If you haven't checked them out before, I really do recommend them. They're individual stories of men who sort of broke outside of the box and to become better, more involved and supportive partners and fathers. So those types of films can say what I've been trying to say in 4 hours in the span of 2 to 5 minutes. And it goes back to that idea of wanting to keep things kind of personal. And then a lot of the participants whom I work with are really concerned with how to make things practical. So the personal stories are nice, the activities are nice, but okay, what are the implications for my program? So I'm constantly working with colleagues here to refine tools that support program planning and how to integrate gender transformative approaches. So usually towards the end of a training, it's really about, taking what you've learned, what you reflected on, and applying that to your everyday work. Okay, I think
Hi, yes, I'm so sorry. Yes, I'm very sorry.
Interviewing myself.
I'm so sorry. Yes, no, that's perfect. I had a technical glitch. I'm very sorry to our audience and to Jane. I'm really, really sorry. My GoToWebinar platform just crashed and I couldn't get back on. But thank you so much. You've been doing a self-interview. That's an amazing start as well. That's really fantastic. So from what I gathered when I tuned back in, you were speaking about the tools and approaches that you use at Promundo and otherwise. So I wonder if we could also discuss, because when we talked, because we've spoken before, when we spoke about the compendium of good practices for training for gender equality, and what I mentioned at the beginning before I was expelled from the platform, that you delivered some really excellent information that we wrote up in our compendium about 2 different cases that Promundo had worked on, one with UNFPA in the Central Asia and Eastern European region, and another with World Fish, which was in 2 very different regions, one in Zambia and one in Cambodia. Yes, and so I think that was an excellent thing. That one thing that I remember you said was that you said the transformation takes time. So gender transformative training has to be a long-term process. And I think you also mentioned once that like one-off trainings are really not the way to go, because training takes time, and because training is a long-term initiative. So I wonder, at Promundo, how do you personally and how do your colleagues evaluate and monitor like this longer-term transformation?
Yeah, good question. I think it goes back to kind of investment, and if you have bought into the idea that a gender transformative approach is something that you want to invest in, not to overuse that word, then it is something that's going to take time. What evidence in the literature really shows is that the longer the intervention, the more likely you are to see sort of more sustainable, longer term changes in terms of behavior change and the like. But in terms of how we monitor and evaluate, we're actually about to release some promising results from our randomized control trial that we did in Rwanda on our fatherhood intervention. And in preparing for that, I know that our researchers spent quite a number of months seeking out to develop and refine measures, including scales, to understand how fatherhood involvement, couple communication, couple decision making, the unpaid care divide, how those shift as a result of this particular intervention. So it's something that we're constantly sort of changing and refining. A lot of our indicators come from the International Men and Gender Equality Survey. The survey is available on Promundo's website, and the survey, which has now been implemented in dozens of different countries, looks at various dimensions of masculinities and how men's childhood experiences, how their experience as adults, and what they believe in and what they practice impact all kinds of different outcomes, including violence against women, fatherhood involvement, mental and physical health, things like that. So a lot of the measures that we use are taken from that study, or taken from that survey. And then in addition to that, adding different measures on top of that. And in terms of how we monitor and how we sort of assess the effectiveness of the implementation of an intervention, not just at the outcomes, it has a lot to do with monitoring and training facilitators, and how good they are at creating trust and confidentiality in a group. Because if a group does not trust their facilitators and what it is that they're saying, or thinks that it's some sort of Western concept that's being imposed upon them, the intervention, your gender transformative intervention won't be effective. So, we're trying to also develop better tools and look at the existing tools that are out there at sort of evaluating facilitator skill. Yeah.
And in terms of, because we've just gotten a couple of questions from our audience members, and there's quite a lot to pick and choose from, really. But just drawing on what you've been saying now, they also ask, do you have any recommendations on raising awareness about among men on the need to increase women's participation at the executive and legislative levels? If Promundo has any practical tips on this, or whether you've personally worked on this specific area.
Yeah, so creating space at the legislative, so with policymakers, so a lot of the advocacy that we've been doing includes presenting evidence that engaging men and boys for gender equality works. So part of that includes giving examples of where particular policies have had a dramatic increase or have affected men's participation in taking parental leave. So advocating for specific things around that. We recently launched our State of the World Fathers, A Time for Action this year, and that includes a series of recommendations that we are currently pushing for policymakers to take on to ensure that or to promote that men take a much more equal role in the unpaid care. So that's one thing. So presenting evidence, using sort of case studies to really make it real and concrete, that this isn't something that's new, but that's been used in other places. So I highly recommend that you check that out. A lot of organizations whom we work with also do lots of trainings with policymakers, decision makers as well, and on the importance of it kind of engaging men in gender equality. And they've included, you know, the sort of that deeper reflection with policymakers themselves on the importance of being more involved. So there, again, that personal aspect combined with presenting best practices is what we found really works for us.
Excellent. That question was from Anna, and Miriam Gonzalez has a question which relates to that, I think, which says that you mentioned it's important to invite men with a strong voice or a powerful voice to use their platforms to promote gender equality. So she wants to know, how do you identify these men?
How do we identify these men? So it's a mix. It's really a mix. I think that, you know, there's a delicate balance that we have to play. I mean, you know, by holding not just men, but any individual up on a pedestal, there's always the risk that that they will do something that actually harms the agenda in the long term. So I think that, you know, holding certain men up as examples, as role models, as champions, you know, has to be done with caution and care to ensure that you share similar values around human rights, around what engaging men means, that we're not reinforcing existing power structures, but that we're actually seeking to disrupt those. So just first of all, being very careful about how that's done, especially when you're working with men in positions of influence and power. But oftentimes, a lot of the men, they come to us. I most recently had an interview with an organization with a young woman a young feminist woman who's been in the spotlight recently, and her father is also very interested in advocating for young girls' access to secondary education. And so, you know, it's sort of both. It's about identifying, but also they also come to us. Well, sorry.
No, that's excellent. No, it's a perfect answer. It's great. So, like, based on that as well, since we're talking about a bit more about how a personal gender training is, and I guess has to be, because we're talking about changing relations, and we're talking about changing mindsets. And I mean, anything transformative has to have a personal aspect. And we've got a question here from Piotr Paulak, who's asked, as a gender trainer himself. You know him. Okay, great. He's asked, as a gender trainer himself, he often has, sort of difficulty dealing and witnessing and experiencing, these stories of violence, and how, and how difficult it is to ensure that reality doesn't impact him as a trainer negatively. So he'd like to know, what are the kind of coping mechanisms that you use, for example, as a trainer and researcher to deal with this kind of information?
Yeah, Peter, really good question. You know, I need to, now we're getting into like some personal reflection of our own. I need to be better. Personally, I need to be better at that. I think the importance of self-care is really something that a lot of us in this field could do a better job of. I think that the times when I feel the healthiest and the best following particularly intense partly because trainings are exhausting because you are not only listening, but you're planning. You are thinking, trying to think 2 steps ahead about what you want to do next. You are trying to resolve some conflict that may be happening in the group. You're doing 4 or 5 different things at the same time. So, you know, having a co-facilitator who you can share the burden with, I think, is really helpful. But not only for that, but to also kind of debrief on what happened that day. So being able to talk with someone about, you know, a particular issue or how it made you recall your own experiences, I think is really important. I talk with office members on GChat or on email or Skype and debrief with them. Exercise, yoga, meditation also really important, but don't we all say that? But yeah, co-facilitators, yeah. But having a co-facilitator, I think, is one of the ways in which I've sort of dealt with that.
I think that's really good. It's a good way to share experiences and to also reflect, I guess, collectively on experiences which may be harmful or difficult to experience, obviously, if you're just doing it alone. And drawing on that, Jason has asked a question, which is a broad question, but I think is related about, you know, what characteristics do you feel are really required for a good trainer?
So 3. Number 1 is being a good listener. I think that a lot of trainings, we can sometimes become so concerned about what we want to say next and what it is that we're trying to teach that we can sometimes not pay adequate attention to the needs of those participants who are in our training. So being a really good active listener, it's harder than you think. Number 2 is organization. For me, I'm very, very organized about how I plan my agenda and how I plan my time, and ensuring that you leave adequate space in your agenda because things are going to change. I mean, it can be something as simple as people just don't come back from tea break in 15 minutes, they 30 or 45 minutes. Or that, you know, you realize that there's a particular issue that demands more attention, so you spend more time doing this one thing. So keeping it keeping your agenda flexible, but also organized, and planning well, coordinating well with your co-facilitator so that you know when each person is going to jump in and out. So I like to plan ahead of time. I know lots of facilitators and trainers are really good at doing things kind of last minute and making it up as they sometimes go, but for me, planning and preparation are really key, and I think shows a level of respect for your participants as well, for their time. And then the third is a good trait is being really learner centered, thinking about what it is that they need and what it is. I like to use different kinds of learning methodologies and finding out what it is that really resonates with them, and employing those tools over and over again in one training, I think also really helps. So figuring out how best they learn or what really appeals to them, I think also helps.
I think that's really good. But I guess the fourth one would be also, as you mentioned, a bit of self-care. So to be very learner-centered, but to not forget that you also need to, remember yourself and your well-being as you go through the whole process. We've got another question as well from Afifa, and I guess because we're running a little bit over, because of my fault completely for having disappeared for half the interview. So we have a last question from Afifa maybe, and she mentions that you talked about, that Promundo has a very strong do no harm focus, and you don't want to reinforce existing power structures. But she says that in developing countries, programs often work with traditional leaders, maybe religious leaders or leaders who are often men, who have certain it might be a bit difficult. You have to tread a fine line, I suppose, when you work with them. So how do you reconcile that with the idea of not reinforcing existing power structures, when many times these people perhaps represent the very power structures that you're trying to challenge? So it must be quite difficult. And how does Promundo negotiate that?
Who asked that question?
It's Afifa Abdurrahman.
Afifa, wow, that's a really, really good question. I mean, from my perspective, it's a negotiation process. I think that part of our approach is about meeting people where they are. That again, that gender transformation is an approach that takes time. That we're not going to change everyone's minds in one training. It's just not possible. The best, thinking about training, not sort of larger scale programs, but thinking about wanting to create that space to challenge perspectives that encourage a diversity of different opinions, and using tools that allow you to do that is I think the most realistic thing that we can hope for in a training. So if you have just 5 days or 3 days or 2 days, really using that time to encourage your participants, because you might think that when you're entering a training that everyone looks and thinks the same, but when you enter a training and you begin having these critical discussions with people, everyone has their own story. Everyone has unique experiences that would cause them to disagree with maybe someone who is in a position of power, and you as a facilitator have to work to create an equal kind of playing field for everybody, and that can be done through creating a group agreement, saying that everyone here is encouraged to sort of say their different opinions. You might use a different methodology where, like, you separate those who are maybe sort of leaders and having their own group with maybe the rest of the participants in your group, having separate discussions, having everyone come back together and share what they discussed. I think that's how I've kind of done it, and it's really frustrating sometimes when you can't change the opinions that you want, but at least creating that space where they can hear diverse perspectives is good.
I think that's a really excellent point to end on, and a really, really good lesson, I guess, for gender training, that we might not be able to change everyone's minds, but creating that space for debate and critical reflection is really, I think, the crux of the matter, and I guess the crux of a gender transformative approach. So, Jane, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you so much for being so patient. And I'm very sorry for disappearing like that in the middle. And thank you so much to all our audience members for being with us. All of you asked such great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but they're all really, really good. And I would encourage all of you to go to our UN Women Training Center Community of Practice discussion forum and post them there. And I can send them on to Jane by email, and she can look at them, and I think we should really continue the discussion, because all of you are asking excellent questions. And also, just to remind you that this recording will be available on our YouTube channel, and I'll send a link to all of you, and so you can listen to it again anytime. And yeah, thank you so much, Jane, and thank you all of you. I hope you all have a really wonderful day.
All right.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.